Are you ready to learn how to build and test your first serverless application? Hello, Datum Nation. If you're new to this channel, I'm Dr. Kev of Datum-Based. I'm a machine learning expert with more than 12 years experience building machine learning solutions and building solutions in the AWS cloud. I'm passionate about teaching you how to build AWS machine learning solutions in the cloud too. In this video, we will build and test a serverless Hello World application. In the last video, we initialized the repo, but in this video, I'm going to walk you through the various files, including the template.yaml and a lot of the Lambda files. Lambda is AWS's compute as a service, so you don't have to deal with any of the instances. You basically just write the function and they handle everything else. We'll also learn how to create an event in the repository so that in the future, if you write your own Lambdas to handle different things, then you'll know exactly how to go get these events so you know how to test your Lambda functions locally. This is super beneficial because then you don't have to deploy anything to the cloud to test your solution. And as solutions get more complex, this is very, very beneficial. Let's stop consuming and start creating. Cue the music. Log in to your AWS account using your username credentials that we created. Next, I'm going to have you go to the search field and look for Cloud9. As you type it in and you go over, you'll see the instance in the list that we created in a couple of videos ago. Now, just click the button to start the IDE back up. So you're going to have to wait a couple minutes because Amazon is actually ramping up an EC2 instance on the back end, which is a compute server, to host this IDE. So it'll take a couple minutes to ramp back up. But the beauty in this is that when it does, it'll pick up right where we left off. So reviewing the Hello World application website, basically it walks through the initializing, the building, the testing, and the deploying of the Hello World app. In this video, we've already covered initialization in the last video, so in this video, we're going to be covering the build portion and the testing locally portion. To be honest, I found the documentation to be a bit simplistic, so I'm going to cover this in much more detail than the documentation does, so you can understand why we use certain settings and what the various underlying files are. We could easily deploy this app right away, but to understand what's happening under the hood is very important, so that's what I'm going to be covering a lot in this video. If you hit up on the keyboard in the terminal, which is the bottom piece of the IDE, you can see the code, you can see the commands that were run previously. Another thing you might want to consider is that once we log back in, you probably want to do an ls and see what directory in, because you might need to cd back into the SAM application directory. If you recall in the last video, the command that we ran was a SAM, which is Serverless Application Model, init, which is initialize command. And we also passed a few different parameters, which you can review and we can discuss in more detail. But essentially, we picked it to be the Lambdas to be a Python-based language for their functions. You can pick anything from Go or Node. There are a bunch of different options, but we picked Python. We also picked pip as our package manager, and then we could also pick what application we ramped up and rename it if we desired. Next, we're going to go over to the file browser that's on the left side of the screen. And with this file browser, we're going to click and open various files so we can investigate and understand what is actually happening in this Hello World app. It's very simple, but if you think about it, there's some functions and then there are a lot of resources that are getting ramped up in the cloud. And so I want to walk you through everything that's happening with a main focus on the .yaml, which is the resources created, and the Lambda in this video. The API gateway stuff won't be covered in detail in this video, and we'll leave that to a future video. So let's start digging in. Go over to the file browser and open the template.yaml file. When you open the file, this is the file that ramps up all the different resources when we deploy this to the cloud. So this handles everything from ramping up the rules to the instances, saving the function in a bucket that can be accessed. Keep in mind that we don't necessarily need this template.yaml. We could log into the AWS Management Console and ramp everything up by hand by clicking around to the different resources and creating the roles and Lambda functions and API gateway all by hand. However, this is very messy, it's hard to track, and as you make changes in the future, it's hard to audit. It's much better to have it in the template file, so in the future, if you want to change your application, it's very straightforward and you can easily change this, what they call stack in CloudFormation. At the top of the template.yaml file, you'll see some boilerplate code. So the very first thing is describing what template that this YAML file is going to follow, and this is just a date. And so as AWS makes changes to the various services or the way parameters are formatted, this date is going to update, but for now you can use the date that's there. The second line is just letting CloudFormation and SAM know that you're going to be actually using SAM to ramp this up. And SAM is a simplistic version of CloudFormation. So some of the underlying, so let's just say we ramp up a Lambda function using the SAM template. There are actually roles and the Lambda function itself and some other permissions that are being created that get expanded out in the CloudFormation template. So this is letting CloudFormation and SAM know that these things need to be expanded out. And the third piece is very self-explanatory. It's just a description of the application. Keep in mind there is a character limit to this field. The next section is globals, and this is specific to SAM templates. CloudFormation doesn't have this field, but since we put that thing at the top letting CloudFormation know it's a SAM template, then we have this field. And what this does is it can apply global parameters across whatever you describe below in the resources section. So in here you can see we set a global timeout for Lambda functions. And that way we don't have to describe it in each of the Lambda functions that we create. This just makes the template shorter if we have a lot of different Lambda functions and easier to change possibly. The next section is the resource section of the template, and this is really where the bulk of what gets created happens. As you can see here, really only one resource is being created. It's a serverless resource. So in ramping this up, CloudFormation knows, and it'll actually break it out into various rules, permissions, Lambda functions, API gateway. So it's not actually just one resource that's getting created, but the SAM template makes things a lot simpler. So we only have to describe one resource and everything else gets ramped up for free. And we'll see this when we go to deploy. We'll dig into what is all getting created by this. It's not going to happen in this video, but in the next video, I'll show you how this gets expanded out and how you can actually log into CloudFormation and see the expanded version of this template. So if we look at this one resource that we have, it is the Hello World function, an AWS Serverless function type. And so what we'll be doing later is Googling this and seeing what all the various parameters are. But for now, let's just skim what's in this template as it exists right now. So the very first thing that's listed is code URI. And what this is if we look over in the file browser, you can actually see this is just the path to the Hello World function that you can click into. The second thing is the actual handler name. So if you open up the app file, you'll see that there's a function in there called Lambda handler. And so what this parameter is defining is just the handler function that gets activated when this function gets called. That this function's operating as Python 3.7. So each function can be a different type, and this was instantiated as Python 3.7 because when we initialized the Hello World app, that's how it got initialized as Python. If we would have specified node, it would be a node function in this case. Below that is where SAM really takes control. And this becomes very special, and we'll cover it in more detail here in a little bit. But what you can do is you can actually describe events that happen, and this is where the API gateway is being formed. So you end up describing an event, and it's called Hello World. We know that it's an API that gets created, hence the API gateway. We can set the path, and you'll see later how this is important when we end up sending a request to the API to get Hello World back. And then this is a get method. The next thing I want you to do is look over in the file browser on the left-hand side, and you'll see a folder called events. And what this is allowing us to do is create events locally so that whenever we go to test this locally, these are the events that we can pass to the various Lambda functions to test that the response is correct. In this case, we're just getting a Hello World response back, but we need the event we're sending it to be similar to whatever we say it is. So in this case, we said it's an API gateway get method. So we want, and finally, if you go back over to the template.yaml file, you'll see the final section is outputs. And this is where you want to save off anything that gets created that you might want to call later or keep track of. This is like the API gateway call, the Lambda ARN, and some other variables that we want to get out of when this is created. So this is basically any resources that are created. If we want to take some parameters out and store them for later calling or to be used in other applications or shared with anyone, this is the section we want to do that. And finally, if you go back over to the app.py and look at the handler function, you can see what the handler function is doing. And really all it's doing is returning a response of hello world. It's a very, very simple function, but it's good to go in and see the format of it and understand what's actually happening under the hood. So I mentioned earlier that there was a README that was created by default when we went into Cloud9 and a README that was created by SAM. Next thing I'm going to do is just delete the default README so that it's not confusing and keep the SAM created one. So now that we've looked at the basic underlying template.yaml file, let's build the application and see what happens. So for this, you're going to want to run a SAM build command, but we also pass it the use container variable, and that's because if you do a version Python or a Python -- version to find out what Cloud9 is running, it's actually a different version of Python than 3.7 that we described as the Lambda function. So if you don't use this use container, things won't build correctly because it'll use the wrong version of Python. So by using this use container, it'll actually build the Lambda function within a container with that version of Python installed. After you run the build command, if you go over to the file browser, you can go up to the top and you can see that a new folder was created. This folder might have a name like .aws- something. If you open it up, it'll have a build folder. And if you go into here, you can actually see the Lambda function that we're looking at in the app.py actually gets compiled with the underlying packages in this build command. So that's what the build command is actually doing, is it's taking these various Python packages, taking the underlying Python handler and packaging everything up together so that we can deploy it to S3 so that whenever we run this in the cloud, it has everything with it when it runs that container. If you go into the template.yaml that's in the build folder, you can see that the Lambda function name has changed and it's like hello world function. And you can see that within that build folder, there's a folder called that. And that's where all the underlying packages and everything to run that Lambda locally is located now. So now that we have this built, what we can do is test locally. So if you go back to your hello world documentation or just follow along on my screen, what we're going to do is invoke Lambda locally. To do that, you're going to use the SAM local invoke, and then you want to pick what Lambda function you're calling and then also pass it the event. So what it'll do is it'll fetch the Docker container, run that event locally, and you should see a success command. It'll also give you some other statistics on runtime, amount of memory used, and this is all important because with Lambda, you only have a few parameters to tune. You basically have a runtime that you can depict, which you remember in the global section, I think we set that to 3 seconds. The only other thing you have in Lambda to tweak is the amount of memory that you allow the Lambda function to have. So by running this locally, it gives you an idea of what these parameters should be set at. So we passed it the event that was in there by default, but how do we know that this was the right format of the event? Like if we were to develop this from scratch, like we would have no idea how to actually go and describe this event. So I'm going to show you right now how to go and do that. So what I'm going to want you to do is go over to the AWS Management Console and type in Lambda. Once we're over in the Lambda screen, I want you to click the Create Lambda function and start from scratch. Name your Lambda function, and then pick the runtime, which we've been using Python 3.7. Don't worry about permissions. They're not going to matter much here because we're just creating this to look at the underlying events for the tests, and then we're going to delete the function anyway. So once you're into the Lambda function screen, you should see the interface. You should see the Lambda function right in the middle of the page. Really, all this Lambda function does is return hello from Lambda. So what I want you to do is go up to the top right where it says test. Click the test button. Once you're in test, there's a drop down that you can click to start picking whatever the event source type is. By default, it says hello world in that drop down, but let's open that up and see what other options there are. So there are tons of options in here. I start typing API so I can find anything associated with API gateway because that's really what we're testing right now locally. So with API gateway, I basically have a proxy and I have an authorizer. In this case, we're looking at the proxy and not the authorizer. So once we click that, it brings up what the event would look like in the box below. And what I'm going to have you do is copy this and paste it over in the Cloud9 IDE events to overwrite the event that's there, because what we want to do is, if we are creating this from scratch, this is what I would recommend doing to go try to figure out what event you were doing. You can see this is an HTTP, a post, which should be very similar to the method that was already in the events. So now that we've pasted that in, run the sam invoke local command again on that new event and just make sure it still runs as it should. What I also want you to do is, as soon as you're done doing this, just go back over to the Lambda console and delete the function that you just created. Next, we're going to dig a little bit more into this AWS Serverless function type that is in the resources of the YAML to understand what all the various parameters mean, what all the options are, and if you were to go develop this on your own, where you'd want to start. So go over to Google, copy and paste this AWS function into Google, and this will take you to the AWS documentation for this SAM data type. So as you can see, when we go over to this SAM, the options for the YAML, there are tons of parameters that could possibly be. So we only really used like 4 or 5 of the various parameters that could exist. However, in scrolling down through this web page, you can see that there are tons of them. And if you click on them, it'll give you more detail in terms of like what each one stands for, what are the various options that you can put in that field. And this really opens up your eyes to all the different ways that this one resource type can be used to build all kinds of different things. So for example, if you go back over to the template.yaml, the first field was code URI. So if you're unsure of what this is and how to specify it, what you do is go over to the web page that we were just looking at and click on the code URI, just like I'm doing in the video. So what this tells you is this can be an S3 path, a local path, and it gives you ideas of how to actually define this in your code set. And this is the same case for all the various parameters. They give you a really great walkthrough for each one and examples. I'm not going to walk through all these different ones, but one of interest is the events, because this is where API Gateway gets ramped up. So let's click down through this a little bit to have a better understanding what's happening. So go over to the web page and click Events. You can see that Events is of type event source, so it doesn't give you much information. So what you need to do is click into event source to find out what else you need to define in event source. So event source has its own properties. So you can see you can pick from various things like API Gateway or S3 or many different resources. And this could be like, depending on like if you put a file in S3, the event would be file create, and that's what you'd be sending over to Lambda. Or in this case, for this function, we're doing a GET request with API Gateway, and so that's the event. So to understand some more of the options for the API Gateway, click the API in the event source type. By clicking this, you'll see what parameters you can be specified for the API creation. And this gets us to about the level where we need to be to understand what's being created. You can click into method and see, you can do a post or a get, or kind of depending on whatever method you want to get. And I think at this point we understand how to navigate the documentation and how to ramp up what we need to ramp up and why the API Gateway is being created for this Lambda function. In the next video, we're going to deploy this Hello World application to AWS. We're going to walk through the resources that are created. We're going to look at the underlying template and all the various resources that CloudFormation breaks out from this SAM template. And I'm going to show you how to make a call to it, and then also how to delete everything with one button click. So we'll clean up the environment. And the beauty in this is that you can try different things and easily clean up your resources, where if we did all this by hand, this could take hours. Please hit subscribe below if you like this content and you want to be notified when I release my next video in this series. The next video is going to be on deploying the serverless Hello World application and walking through the resources that are created and how to actually verify that it's working appropriately. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.